The year is 1863, and railroad construction is absolutely booming. In 6 years, the U.S. will be linked by rail from coast to coast. Central Pacific Railroad employs mainly Chinese immigrants to blast tunnels, lay track, and drive spikes, all for very low wages. You're a journalist assigned to describe this monumental construction project for your readers. What are the pros and cons of this industrial railroad expansion? So this next unit is about industrialization. Industrialization is the process of transforming a society from an agrarian society into an industrial one. From one in which most people farm and work in agriculture to produce foodstuffs, both self-sustainable and for production for society, to an industrial one in which machines are doing a variety of different jobs and work. Here's your intro story. One day, Patillo Higgins noticed that there were bubbles in the springs around Spindletop. Spindletop was a hill near Beaumont in eastern Texas, and this and other signs convinced him that there was oil underground. If Higgins could find oil, it could serve as a fuel source around which a vibrant industrial city would develop. Keep in mind this is a time period where people are using kerosene, whale oil. Fuels are more difficult to come by. And so the availability of a cheap petroleum product like oil would really be a game changer. Higgins, who had been a mechanic and a lumber merchant, couldn't convince geologists or other investors that oil was present, but he did not give up. He ran a magazine ad seeking investors. He got one response from Captain Anthony Lucas, an experienced prospector who also believed that there was oil at Spindletop. When other investors were slow to send money, Higgins kept his faith, not only in Spindletop, but in Lucas. This is Patillo Higgins' own words. Captain Lucas, these experts come and tell you this or that can't happen because it's never happened before. You believe there's oil here, and I think you're right. I know there's oil here in greater quantities than man has ever found before. In 1900, the two men found investors, and they began to drill that autumn. After months of really difficult, frustrating work, on the morning of January 10th of 1901, oil gushed from their well. The Texas oil boom had begun, so Spindletop is right here. And that led to an absolute industrial shift, both in the United States and around the world. So, like I'd said before, maybe I didn't say before, because I had to restart this video a couple times, there was a first industrial revolution that happened in Great Britain and a second industrial revolution that happened in the United States. I want you to listen carefully to the social, the economic, and the changes that happened in Great Britain that we can expect to hear in this unit about the things that happen in the United States. So listen for foreshadowing and then hopefully parallels as we move through the unit. This will take 3.5 minutes.
Industrial Revolution, 18th to 19th century. The economic developments of the 1800s saw the development of agrarian and handicraft economies in Europe and America transform into industrial urbanized ones. The term to describe this phenomenon would be known as the Industrial Revolution, and was first used by French writers, but made popular by English economic historian Arnold Toynbee. The Industrial Revolution was underpinned by the Agricultural Revolution. From the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century, agricultural production increased significantly. The huge increase in food output supported the expansion and sustained a large population and boosted trade. The increased use of machines over human or animal power in farming also meant that less farm workers were needed, and they could leave the land to industrial towns. Better metals and richer fuel also contributed to industrialization by creating the steam engine, an integral machine to industrialization which powered factories, locomotives, and ships. The new steam engines used coal and iron, both in their construction and as fuel, increasing demand for these resources. Roads, canals, and railways changed Britain dramatically, connecting Britain and allowing goods to be sent over long distances. Visually, the revolution was clear in the new industrial towns, with smoking factories dominating the skyline. The cities were horrible to live in, overcrowded and dirty with dangerous conditions in the factories and strict rules and punishments. The Industrial Revolution saw mechanization in factories of the textile industry, which was previously manufactured in the home, creating the term cottage industry. Now, production could be increased on a large scale because of new inventions such as the spinning mule and the power loom. The iron industry developed with Henry Bessemer's inexpensive process for mass producing steel. Iron and steel were key materials for constructing the tools and machinery, steam engines, and ships needed for the industrial progress. Industrial labor opportunities drew people to the cities from the countryside, to such an extent that in 1750 only 15% of the population of Britain lived in towns. By 1850, over 50% of the entire population of Great Britain lived in either a town or a city, and by 1900 it was 85%. London had 4.5 million people, Glasgow 760,000, Liverpool 685,000, and Manchester and Birmingham 500,000. Great Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and was the only mature industrial economy for a long time. Historians have speculated that this was because, as an island, there was relative peace and stability for Britain compared to mainland Europe. Rather than spending on a large defensive standing army, capital could be spent on other ventures, and there was confidence for investors. Native resources were also abundant and readily available for initial technological developments and inventions. Engineers and inventors were also respected and encouraged in British society, and were backed by wealthy patrons. A powerful navy and an empire bringing in vast wealth from its colonies also contributed to the catalyst for industrialization before others. Nevertheless, Germany, France, Switzerland, Belgium, and the United States soon emulated Britain's industrial change, and by 1900, Britain would no longer be at the top, with the United States as the world's leading industrial nation in the 20th century.
Subscribe for more.
Okay, so the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in the 1840s, and it actually was against the law for people to take like technological secrets about the Industrial Revolution out of the country. However, you know that sort of thing is really difficult to legislate. And so, sure enough, a guy named Samuel Slater, who's right here, quietly left Great Britain and brought his ideas about the textile industry and industrializing the textile industry with him. So he snuck out really quietly, and the Industrial Revolution was spread supposedly to the United States via Samuel Slater. So here are some of the people that you'll meet in this unit: Thomas Edison, Christopher Sholes, Alexander Graham Bell, Edwin Drake, Henry Bessemer, J.P. Morgan, amongst others, John D. Rockefeller. There are going to be some really interesting people in this unit. And we will talk about mechanization, the Bessemer process, and industrialization, and how it impacted our society both socially, politically, and economically. So the new industrial age begins. Here's your Roman numeral 1 for your notebook. And away we go. So after the Civil War, the United States was still largely an agricultural nation. But by the 1920s, a mere 60 years later, it had become the leading industrial power in the world, which is pretty amazing. This immense industrial boom was due to three major factors, and we're going to cover them right here. And you'll notice that if you watch the video carefully, these same factors applied for the most part, to Great Britain. So the first was a wealth of natural resources, particular natural resources that would lead to fueling an industrial revolution. Government support for businesses. In the video, they talked about people sponsoring and offering capital to these early investors, they're early investors to these factories. And our government will do that same sort of thing. And in addition, a growing urban population that provides really cheap labor and a market for new products. So away we go. So by the 1920s, the United States is the world's leading industrial power due to an unbelievable wealth of natural resources. The natural resources that we're talking about are iron ore, coal, and eventually oil. And those things will be used to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Government support for business. For example, in Section 2, we're going to talk about the railroads and use railroads as kind of a case study of the industrialization. But for example, the federal government granted massive swaths of land to the railroad companies to help subsidize so that they could sell that land off and help pay for the expansion of the railroad. Without the government support, it would have been difficult for them to find that kind of capital. And then finally, while industrialization is happening, there is immigration is strong in the United States, and it continues to provide a cheap labor source to the factories and to the industries that are growing. Though Eastern Native American tribes had made fuel and medicine from crude oil long before Europeans arrived on the continent, early American settlers had really little use for oil. In the 1840s, Americans began using kerosene to light lamps after a Canadian geologist, Abraham Gesner, discovered how to distill the fuel from oil or coal. But it wasn't until 1859 that Edwin Drake successfully used a steam engine to drill for oil near Titusville, Pennsylvania. Removing oil from beneath the Earth's surface became practical at that point, and at that point then, they started to look at oil as a more practical fuel. This breathtaking adventure started an oil boom that spread to Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and then later, of course, Texas. Petroleum refining industries arose in Cleveland and Pittsburgh as entrepreneurs rushed to transform the oil into kerosene. Gasoline at this point is a byproduct of creating kerosene out of the petroleum product and was literally thrown away. After the automobile became popular, of course, gasoline became more important than the kerosene. In addition to figuring out how to practically drill for oil and using that to fuel part of our Industrial Revolution, these are contemporary small-scale oil drills in Texas that I saw when I was driving through. In addition to that, we also had the products that were necessary for creating steel. So oil was not the only natural resource that was plentiful in the United States. There was also an abundant deposit of coal and iron. In 1887, prospectors discovered iron ore deposits more than 100 miles long and up to 3 miles wide in something called the Mesabi Range in Minnesota. At the time, coal production skyrocketed from 33 million tons in 1870 to more than 250 million tons in 1900. Iron is a dense metal, but it is soft and tends to break and then rust. It also usually contains other elements like carbon. Removing the carbon from iron produces a lighter, more flexible, and rust-resistant metal called steel. The raw materials needed to make steel were readily available. All that was needed was a cheap, efficient manufacturing process, and the Bessemer process came along and provided that. So the Bessemer process, developed independently by both a British manufacturer named Henry Bessemer and an American iron maker named William Kelly around 1850, soon became widely used. This technique involved injecting air into molten iron to remove the carbon and other impurities. By 1880, American manufacturers were using this new method to produce more than 90% of the nation's steel. In this age of rapid change and innovation, even the successful Bessemer process was bettered by 1860. It was eventually replaced by something called the open hearth process, enabling manufacturers to produce quality steel from scrap metal as well as raw materials. The railroads, with thousands of miles of track, became the largest consumers of this new steel, but inventors soon found additional uses for it. For example, Joseph Glidden created barbed wire, and McCormick and Deere's farm machines helped transform the plains into food producers of the nation. So railroads, Glidden's barbed wire, and McCormick's and John Deere's farm machinery helped transform things. One of the most remarkable structures was the Brooklyn Bridge. Completed in 1883, it spanned 1,595 feet of the East River in New York City. Its steel cables were supported by towers higher than any man-made and weight-bearing structure except the pyramids of Egypt. Like those ancient marvels, the completed bridge was called a wonder of the world. In addition, we'll start building up with steel, not just out. Around the time setting the stage for a new era of expansion upward as well as outward, a guy named William LeBaron Jenney designed the very first skyscraper with a steel frame, the Home Insurance Building in Chicago. Before Jenney had his pioneering idea, the weight of large buildings was supported entirely by their walls or by iron frames, which limited the building's height. With steel frames to support the weight, however, architects could build just about as high as they wanted. A structure soared into the air, not even the sky seemed to limit what Americans could achieve. This coal, early iron, Bessemer. And while Bessemer was busy producing the Bessemer process, a guy named William Kelly was also creating the same sort of process in the United States, and this allowed for the creation of steel. This was part of a story. One of the ways that Kelly figured out that all he had to do was blow hot air onto iron to create steel. He did it accidentally. He used the bellows. He was trying to create more heat on the iron, and he used the bellows, which is this big kind of pad that pushes air into the fire and kind of causes it to heat up. But when he did that, he got a blast back of carbon dioxide, and he passed out. And when he came to, he started thinking about, like, why did that happen? And he finally decided to try just blowing hot, just air on the iron. And sure enough, it heated the iron up. Just the air heated the iron up to reduce the impurities in it to create steel. So something so simple as blowing air onto the hot iron ended up creating steel. Here's just a quick map showing you that these the iron ore and the coal deposits just so happen to be right here in the northeast part of the United States, some of the largest deposits in the entire world, and side by side. So the fuel for this Industrial Revolution just happened to geologically just be, by happenstance, right underground, which is one of the reasons that it takes off in the United States. Just showing you coal production around the world in the early 1900s. And you can see the United Kingdom up here producing 236 million short tons. And then look at the United States down here, 350 million short tons. Okay, and today other places around the world are experiencing their own industrial revolution. China, for example, their coal production recently has gone way up, while other countries are beginning to seek other fuel sources that are cleaner and more sustainable.